We're back with the Tech Policy Grind. I'm Rima Musa, and I'm a fellow with the Internet Law and Policy Foundry, the organization where the next generation of tech law and policy professionals convene to write, think, and talk about the web, technology, and disruptive innovation. This is the Tech Policy Grind, the Foundry's podcast where we chat about what's going on in the world of tech policy.
Welcome back to the Tech Policy Grind. I'm Evan Ezzell. I'm a fellow with the Internet Law and Policy Foundry, and I'm the regular editor for this podcast. This week's episode is another edition of our Policy Hackathon webinar series, condensed and packaged into a podcast format for the show. If you're new to TPG and the Foundry, the theme for the upcoming Policy Hackathon is artificial intelligence. Running up to our annual event, the Foundry is hosting bi-weekly webinars diving into some of the nuances around law and policy topics that intersect with critical AI issues. Today's episode features a conversation led by Fellow Lama Mohammed discussing bias within AI and potential ways to mitigate those harms. The panel featured Jiahao Chen of Responsible AI LLC, Ezzell, Policy Counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum, and Juhi Koré, who works in the digital office of the United Nations Development Program. Together, these experts touched on defining AI bias, why bias is harmful, global AI policy developments, and more. I want to give a special thank you to all of our guests for joining the Foundry in our webinar series. You can follow them on LinkedIn to learn more about their work. And if you're a Rima superfan, don't worry, you'll hear from her again at the end of the show. Enjoy the episode.
Good afternoon. My name is Lama Mohammed, and I'm a Class 4 Fellow with the Internet Law and Policy Foundry. Today, we will be diving deep into the world of artificial intelligence bias. This year, you cannot go a day without reading about artificial intelligence since the recent hype around generative artificial intelligence such as DALL-E and ChatGPT. While innovation in AI creates new possibilities, the increased use of this technology does not eradicate previous issues with accountability, fairness, and transparency. Joining us today to discuss the top button topic are AI bias experts Jiahao Chen, Ezzell, and Juhi Koré. To start, I would like to ask our panelists what artificial intelligence is and what AI bias is as well, and some of the ways that it could cause harm to marginalized or vulnerable communities. Thank you for joining. Amber, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So to level set, AI systems are used in several different sectors to make decisions that impact people's lives. So this includes housing, credit, hiring, management, to name a few. And we've all probably interacted with artificial intelligence in some way. And so these systems are built on large quantities of data and often include data that is entrenched with historical biases and discrimination. And then they are used to train these systems in making decisions. And so the systems are also designed by organizations that can code them to behave in certain ways. So this includes either like prioritizing or deprioritizing certain data points, like those that are directly or indirectly related to protected classes. And so these design decisions can be made to either offset existing biases or further discriminate. And so AI bias is essentially how artificial intelligence systems make or impact decisions that disproportionately harm groups or individuals, usually around these protected statuses, like I just mentioned. So race, gender, sexual orientation, disability status, as some others. And if not accounted for, AI bias can reinforce and exacerbate communal, individual, and societal harms, and harm individuals by denying them of important opportunities and prevent communities from receiving proper resources and support. And one of the other things is that it can also limit societal innovation, which I'm sure that we'll talk about today. So if it's not accounted for, it can reinforce discrimination and harm individuals and communities.
I think that was a great response, Amber. So I also wanted to say, like, based on maybe state something a little more concrete in terms of my experience in banking. So it's discrimination is obviously a very big part of AI bias, but we also think about exclusionary effects. So things that are not directly about discriminating on the basis of race, gender, age, but also just the fact that maybe you're making a data-driven decision and there are people you don't have data about. So in the credit space, we talk about people called credit invisibles. So people who perhaps are new immigrants to the country, or they don't have a family tradition or history of having an existing relationship with a financial institution. And so these people don't have records on credit bureaus. Therefore, they don't exist as far as the data-driven credit making industry is concerned. Now, of course, there are issues here that intertwine, so it's not like a clean separation, right? You could also say that because of social historical issues, social and economic issues, there is structural correlation between belonging to a particular minority or disadvantaged group and also not having enough data. And so just something to think about also, it's about who isn't represented in your data set and therefore is excluded just by virtue of not being in your data set.
Absolutely. And I also think, in terms of things that people are implementing or using on a daily basis, for example, when we think about calling like a bank, you're always interacting with these language and speech processing systems. And a lot of them are not really tailored to every possible accent or dialect, especially when it comes to individuals from marginalized communities. And that can also lead to a lot of frustration for the users. And overall, I think one of the main things that the bias really results in is a general sense of loss of trust. And that can really make people avoid using the systems, which can then really prevent the AI from being trained in actually improving things for those communities as well.
There are a lot of anxieties around generative artificial intelligence since it is being trained on large language models or LLMs that may contain biased data. So how could these forms of AI deepen systemic discrimination against marginalized communities? It's already really hard for people of color, at least in the United States, to get a mortgage. Communities in the global South are sort of already disproportionately not brought to the table because of the digital divide. And so I'm kind of wondering how you're seeing this in each of your respective fields. See how you can start.
Sure. So I think one of the first questions to ask is, why is there systemic discrimination? Why are people being disadvantaged? And oftentimes it comes down to myriad reasons, but you have to think about why those reasons interact to produce, to make it harder to collect data about these particular groups. So oftentimes, yes, there is a lot of political, social, and economic factors behind that. But really, when it manifests itself in a data-driven environment, it's like we just don't have data because somehow it was more expensive to collect that data. Therefore, at the current cost of collecting data, it was just not possible. And so that means that if you really want to put in effort to be more inclusive, that means you actually have to spend more resources to go collect the data on these people because by definition, those people were costly to collect data from and they were too costly for your current process. And so thinking what that means for your specific use case, for the various data sources you're using, I think is number one. And then on the flip side, I also mentioned something which I call the missing stakeholder problem. I think, just to level set and we've seen a lot of interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is great. As when recent events in the US have obviously amplified the need for that, but also we're seeing the same kinds of failure modes that can happen when companies don't put them in the same room as the people who are making the business critical decisions, and then they're left out, or they're not in the same room to help guide that discussion. And so, are they just there for the sake of being there? Or are they actually part of your decision-making process? Similarly, when you think about AI, are they part of the design process? Are they there to provide feedback on, this AI might have this side effect. Have you thought about that? And maybe the engineer should be thinking about that. Maybe the people who are responsible for the business process need to actually go out there and monitor what's happening on the ground. Or you're just putting your blind faith in the data and that you have the right observations in place to measure all the effects that you want. And there's definitely something here about unintended consequences, which creates a systemic blind spot. Because you don't think about them, you don't put in the effort to collect data to see if something bad is happening, and then the bad thing happens. So that's a very, very common failure mode that I wanted to bring up. I'll limit myself to just one more comment, which is one of the particularly interesting things about large language models is the question of who owns the data, who owns the corpus of language. And I want to point out that there's actually some really interesting work in the indigenous ownership of language data. So when you think about corpuses of oral histories, of written texts, is that a collective ownership problem? And whose legal structures do you respect? So this comes up all the time when you think about indigenous rights. And I think probably my other panelists are more expert at this than I am. But who owns that data? What does responsible usage mean? What kind of compensation should people receive for using that data? And so this is something obviously that's coming up right now, not just in the LLM space, but in like the generative art space and copyright, and who deserves compensation for using all of that. That is coming to the forefront, and I think we need to think about what that means so that AI can benefit everyone.
I wanted to bring you in here too because you work with communities in the global south. So how does systemic bias look like there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges we see is, what the data sets look like, because a lot of these data sets were not always collected. Like Jiahao was saying, making sure that all the possible stakeholders were involved. And so when we're building tools now, we really try to make sure that we are going in and collecting data from all possible sources, especially if, we're trying to create a tool, for example, around content moderation for people from marginalized communities and kind of conflict areas. We have to put in, even during that data collection, it is quite an intensive process because we have to anonymize everything from kind of the get-go. So nobody can even know who's actually been participating in that data collection. So really trying to ensure that privacy is at the center of all of this and that data protection guidelines are ensured. And a lot of this, when we think about public services, we really want to make sure that we're also collaborating with not just the governmental entities, but also civil society organizations. If we're working on gender issues, women's rights organizations that are sometimes more entrenched within the communities than the government entities themselves, and actually have those kind of trusting relationships with the individuals so that we can get the best data. Because ultimately, it's really expensive to debias data sets. And so we want to make sure that any new data sets that are being created are really kind of encompassing all possible perspectives, are really trying to consider every possible data point. And that's, obviously going to lead into making sure that the products we're building are the most ethical that they can be.
Absolutely. Amber, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, very little, because Juhi and Jiahao definitely hit the nail on the head with that one. I think that both of my co-panelists have really underscored, issues of trust. I think that it's really a double-edged sword, because LLMs, they reflect underlying data that they're trained on, which is, often incomplete and biased and outdated. And the training data sets, often exclude data from marginalized and minority communities. And, because of this, it has the risk of reflecting and perpetuating biases that exist. But on the flip side, it's really difficult because, in order to have this data to train, there has to be consent, right, to collect this data. And I think that, especially, in communities that have been historically, marginalized and disenfranchised, there is, lack of trust in terms of where is my data? Where are you going to get the data from, to train these models? And, it makes me think about whose responsibility is it to train these models and on whose data? So it's really a double-edged sword, because, you want these technologies to be reflective of, society as a whole, but also, making sure that you have the appropriate consent.
Thank you. I want to shift the conversation over to policy. How could policies like the White House AI Bill of Rights or the EU AI Act or Brazil's new AI policy could help or hinder regulate this technology? And is regulation enough to mitigate AI bias? Amber, I'd like you to start with this one. Not to put you on the spot.
No, sure thing. So, one of the things that we're seeing in the policy space is that there is, growing consensus from policymakers and civil society and industry that there needs to be some form of AI regulation. So what that regulation looks like, what it does, how it's enforced, who bears that responsibility and liability. If I had the answers to that, I'd probably get paid a lot more than what I do. But, it really shows that there is that growing consensus, and in certain sectors like housing and employment, education, healthcare, lending, like we've talked about a little bit already. Regulators have already been taking enforcement actions in the U.S. on AI systems and tools, specifically in regard to discriminatory practices. And so, for example, the FTC has already begun enforcement on AI systems that are misleading under, their unfair and deceptive trade practice authority. And just recently, like a few weeks ago or a month ago at this point, the FTC and CFPB, DOJ and EEOC released a joint statement that underscored that they're committed to exercising their authority to promote responsible innovation in AI systems. And so, regardless of what jurisdiction we're talking about, any form of AI regulation has to, keep in mind, especially that there's agencies that do have expertise in these areas already. It may not be that they're AI experts, but, there are agencies that enforce housing and lending and employment and all of these other things. And so, they have that area of expertise. And so they already have begun regulating AI in their respective spaces.
Juhi, do you want to comment on the role of policy and maybe what the UN thinks about this?
I definitely cannot speak, on behalf of the UN, but we obviously, I think are very keen for countries to act. And I think especially when we think about these legislative documents that are kind of being formulated, I think multi-stakeholder collaboration is kind of the absolute key, like what Amber was saying. I think it's really, really important for governments to recognize that there are other experts that do understand these things. I also think, in general, there really needs to be a change in the overall culture when it comes to thinking about ethical AI or AI regulation. Really, the people that are building these systems and tools, they should already kind of, that first level of development should already start incorporating regulation and ensuring that they're building equitable technologies. And I think that is obviously not a simple or easy solution at all, but I do think it's quite critical. And there's, when you think about who is building these tools, a lot of the times they're people from Western countries, generally white men. Still, if you look at the teams for most of the generative AI software as well, it's really, really important that we're making sure that these teams first and foremost look like the people that are going to be using the tools. And then secondly, have this sense of accountability and transparency while they're developing the products themselves. And I think, both the AI Bill of Rights as well as the EU AI Act are both really, really important and great steps forward. But they haven't been implemented yet. And we really need to make sure that everyone's voices are being taken into account during the development process of these policies as well. It's not just about making sure that governments are regulating these things, but really taking everyone's opinions into consideration.
So I am clearly not the policy expert here, but I'll mention what has come up in client discussions. First of all, there's a lot of talk about what is the US doing, what is Europe doing as far as AI regulation. But let's be aware that this is a global problem, and there's global groundswell. Obviously, the fact that we have someone from the UN here, I think, is testament to that. But also, let's bring up some things that maybe people may not have heard of. So things like India's digital rights bill, the Digital India Act. So it's about data protection, but it's also about AI. It's about reducing user harms. Indonesia is working on something called Stratnas AI, which is like the national AI strategy for the next 20 years until 2045. Singapore, where I'm from, they just launched an AI Verify Foundation, which is meant to be a cooperative private-public foundation working on how model testing and AI testing ought to work. And this is just three of like many different countries around the world that's working on something. Let's not forget that China, while maybe having its particular day in the realm of U.S. politics, is actually extremely active in producing AI policy and regulation and legislation. So all of that's happening, and I'm just going to put that aside of like how it's happening and what is it doing and is it aligned with Western democratic values. But we should acknowledge that they are doing work in this area as well. With all of that, I'll just mention one thing, which is one huge pain point for companies is this regulatory divergence. The fact that laws are different in every country, or laws are different in every state. Regulations and policies are different. The way you interact with government, and what government's rights are or expectations are to transparency of what businesses are doing, the accountability structures to private citizens, that's all different. And it creates enormous headaches for the perhaps naive customer who thinks that like, well, I built a successful business for this AI service in Europe. I'm going to expand to North America, and now everything will magically work. But maybe if your product is actually a resume screening tool or like a video interview scoring tool, guess what? Like employment is one of those areas where like every jurisdiction is different, even within the US, let alone across US and Europe. And one should realize that that's something that is part and parcel of the industry and product offering that you're working in, and is not something that you can just wave away by fiat.
I just want to quickly add to that. I think it's so important, like you said, Jiahao, that different countries make that there currently isn't really any exact science to how this plays out in every single country and context. And one of the things that UNDP is currently doing is actually building these AI readiness assessments through which we're actually trying to map out what a successful AI strategy looks like, and trying to ensure any country that really wants to build an AI strategy, national strategy for themselves, we're actually going in and we're able to help them understand where they are at in terms of best practices globally, and then also help them actually build this roadmap to getting there. And obviously making sure that transparency, accountability, and data protection are kind of all embedded throughout the strategy. But really, I think there really isn't much consensus, and we're really trying to help build that.
And I know Jiahao was saying that he's not necessarily a policy person. However, you do work with technologists, so and anyone can really comment. But what can technologists or civil society, or as someone in the chat said, students can do to prevent bias when working, developing, or using AI-enabled technology?
I guess I can start that. So from a technologist perspective, it's prevention is better than cure. It is a lot easier to fix problems at design time than at production time. Oftentimes, that means not just thinking about representativeness or like potential for bias in data sets, but also in the way that you define the objectives and criteria for success for the AI system. I think I'll highlight that. I think a lot of times people talk about bias in the sense of like, oh, we have imbalanced data. We don't have enough information about women in my data set for this use case, or like minorities, something like that. But actually, it can also be present in the definition of the use case itself, and that's actually more pernicious. So just to give a very simple example, that's not AI. So suppose you want you want to give a written exam to your employees because it tests like domain-specific knowledge that you want all your employees to have, which sounds great on paper, but let's say it's only offered in English, and then you don't offer accommodations for people who are visually impaired or have writing or dyslexic, like any sort of like, learning disability or that kind of thing. So if you do not change the fact that the test is only offered in English, in writing, and no accommodations are made, all the DEI to get people through the door from the disabled community, the non-English speaking communities will not help the fact that they're just going to fail the test. And so are you even defining your criteria in a way that's intrinsically biased is something that I would point out. And so this is part of a larger discussion of let's fix things at design time because it's cheaper and you can iterate through all the possible failure modes in a much cheaper way than if you had to fix it afterward. I'll just end with one thing, which is there's oftentimes a technologist's pipe dream that, okay, well, we found bias in the model. Okay, fine, we'll just apply some debiasing technique and then magically the bias will go away. There's actually been some research in this area. And my own contribution to this study in ML research is to point out that actually we can prove that most of these methods work by overfitting. So basically you found a bad example and you tell the model, don't do that next time. Make sure that this decision is on the positive side, not the negative side for this kind of input. But what you eventually do is that you're encouraging the model to overfit on that. And so that actually could create worse outcomes on average for everyone else. So you're basically dragging and lowering the standard for everyone. And that's the cost that you pay for debiasing. To give a very trivial example, if everyone failed the exam and you hired nobody, then it's trivially fair because the same number of men and women were admitted, but that's not the outcome you want because now nobody got hired. Right. It's very these kinds of like purely quantitative or metrics driven approaches to debiasing can result in these kinds of corner cases that sound stupid to us as humans. Like, obviously we don't want the AI to do that, but from a pure mathematical definition, if that's all you're optimizing for, that could be one of the solutions that you get.
Yeah, I can jump in here too. I really I like what Jiahao said about making sure that you're being proactive in terms of, as you're even developing the technologies. But yeah, I would say that a big thing is also making sure that that there's diverse voices that are integrated all throughout the life cycle of the technology as well. So, not just in the development piece, but also, as you're testing it, like continuing to test it, like making sure that it's doing what you want it to do, and even checking the outputs as well. So just making sure that you're checking and checking and checking again, and that there are, like we talked about before, like making sure that there are those in the room that are going to look like the folks that are going to be impacted by the technology, which is essentially all of us, right? And so making sure that that you're checking for those things all throughout the life cycle. And I think that another thing that we've mentioned already is that some people really trust in technology a lot. And they might argue that AI-powered technology is, less ripe of discrimination than having a human make the same decisions. I think that, I see this especially like in the hiring context. Like, oh, well, if we're having, these decisions be made by, an AI tool, then, it doesn't take into account, the kind of bias that someone who's, an actual person who's looking at these technologies. But really, AI just reflects underlying historical biases and discrimination and outdated stereotypes. And so, it's really important to be careful, again, like about the types of data that's being used to train these systems, and making sure that you're checking and checking again, like the outputs, to make sure that it's actually doing what you want it to do. So, trust but verify, as you're developing these tools, making sure that, that you're checking it and checking it again to make sure that it's actually doing, what you intend.
Awesome. Before we conclude, I kind of wanted to shift gears a little bit and move on from not just biased data, but potentially biased use. So imagine we are in a world where there are AI services and tools with little to no bias. Utopia. Facial recognition software can detect the faces of every individual equally. Everyone has the same opportunity to receive a loan from an AI-powered lender, etc. But how do we make sure that the way we are using AI is also fair and unbiased? How do we make sure the use of this powerful technology is kept in check by law enforcement, by schools, etc.? Amber, I feel like you would have an interesting take on this if you want to start.
Oh man, no, thanks for putting me on the spot. This is a really tough question, and I think that it's really important. I think that this would be an ideal world, but it's really, I think especially in like my work, as I've been helping companies, think about the way that their employees are using generative AI. I've seen this a lot. Like, how do we make sure that our employees are using this in a responsible way that's not going to get us in trouble, right? But I think that, one of the focuses on use cases is important. And, a lot of jurisdictions are focused on high risk use. So just making sure that they also understand, like, is this actually the right way to go about solving this problem? And I don't know if folks have seen it because it's hot off the press, but yesterday in the New York Times, Senator Warren and Senator Graham, they noted that these technologies are not chosen by people, and that this is like an important context to keep in mind, when they're thinking about how these technologies are used. And so, I don't have like a concrete answer for, how we can make sure that people are using it in a fair and unbiased way, outside of really just educating people. Because, I've seen like just in talking to friends, people are asking me like, what is this ChatGPT thing? Like, how can I make it, how can I make it work to my favor so that I can do my job better or faster? So I think it's important, like education is really key in terms of, people even understanding how the technology works in the first place. Like that's step one, because some people really think that, this is like the end all be all solution to how to be more efficient. And so, really just educating and educating again to make sure that people understand how the technologies work and also that they can, exacerbate existing biases. And so, it goes back to the collaboration piece as well. Like there's going to be people who are going to have to go out and do the education, just like there are those that are out doing the development of these technologies. And so, and then there's companies that are going to be, using it to make decisions about people's everyday lives. And so it's really important that like policymakers and civil society and industry are going to all work together to figure out exactly what these guardrails are going to look like. And it also, comes down to consumers really being educated and being able to speak up, when they see something that they don't necessarily agree with as well.
Yeah, I really agree with everything Amber said. I think on that education element, really focusing on, even if all the data sets are completely unbiased and all the AI is working in a very fair and equitable way, we still need to think about the outputs, and we really need to think about the education element, focusing on telling people, hey, this is how the AI is supposed to work. But if it doesn't work in this way, these may be, that there are always going to be risks, and to educate people on the risks of those AI systems, just to make sure that, people aren't blindly following what the AI algorithms are telling them, really making sure that the education component focuses on critical thinking, critical analysis, and really helping people visualize what the potential risks or like misuses could be. And I think the other kind of element of, even in a world where all the AI systems might be really fair and unbiased, if they're being used by, for example, law enforcement agencies, still ensuring that there is a lot of accountability in place, and that there's also a lot of transparency to ensure that, if law enforcement is using AI in a certain way, it's still not impacting certain communities more than others, and also ensuring that ultimately we are thinking about people's privacy and civil liberties. We really want to make sure that if surveillance technologies are available, they're not being misused, and just generally keeping, I think, privacy and data protection at the center of that.
Let's just discard the case where of considering like unbiased AI, because it just doesn't exist, right? So with that in mind, if you know that, and as fundamentally AI is statistically driven, is probabilistic, then that means that there will always be errors. Now the question is, are you aware of the business process in which you're using it? Because even if you think about passport control, if you think about police surveillance, it's not used in isolation. It's not like the AI is not out there automatically arresting suspicious people, right? This is being escalated for human police officers to look at. and they make the call as to whether it warrants further investigation, if there's a mistake that needs to be overridden and said, like, this is a false alert. And what's that whole process look like? And from a technology perspective, I think there's the way that we do development, it's very like short cycle. It's very like, let's go to market quickly. That drives a very utilitarian look at AI to say that there's a happy path. Most people fall into this class. Having a solution that works for this class creates the greatest good for the greatest number. I'm done. Actually, that's just the beginning. And I think really people should be thinking about outliers and edge cases, because guess what? Like, if you are serious about inclusion, you're thinking about how marginalized groups fall outside of the happy path, how they would otherwise fall between the cracks. And are you monitoring? Is there something to catch you if you're in an exceptional edge case? So imagine a situation where like you've optimized everything for like the base class, like the most common class, but maybe there's still systemic discrimination because all the people in this particular minority group don't have the right kind of biometric passport. They can never use the automated kiosk. They always have to go talk to a manual, to a human passport officer. And so everyone gets through immigration on like the electronic visa, the biometric passport quickly, except unless you come from these countries where like, I don't let you use the biometric passport. So that, plan an extra 3 hours for your connecting flight, right? So, and like, who is in that edge case, and is belonging to that edge case more likely to signal membership in some sort of marginalized group, is something that we should be thinking about more. And it's about catching people who fall off of the path that it was intended for, because that's oftentimes like the assumption that leads to actual discriminatory impact.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank our incredible guest panelists for an enlightening conversation on this very critical issue.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Likewise, thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Tech Policy Grind. If you enjoyed the show, get in touch with us at Foundry Podcasts with an S at ilpfoundry.us, or leave us a review wherever you're tuning in. I'm Rima Musa, the host of the show, and this podcast wouldn't be possible without the help of our team at the Internet Law and Policy Foundry. Thank you to Evan Enzer for editing this episode, Lama Mohammed, our social coordinator, Allison McReynolds, our accessibility coordinator, and Tim Lorden at the Internet Education Foundation. See you next time.